The applause was still echoing through the commissary of trade when Delegate Prefect Solène Croche of the Vethani Mercantile Sovereignty raised her crystalline goblet and aimed the toast directly at the empty chair. "To our absent friends from Earth," Croche said, her mandibular plates clicking in a pattern that the other delegates recognized as refined amusement, "who have graciously agreed to participate in tomorrow's commodity exhibition. We look forward to their contribution, brief as it will undoubtedly be." The laughter that followed was not unkind. It was worse than unkind. It was comfortable. The kind of laughter that happens when a room full of professionals shares an understanding so settled it no longer requires explanation. 46 species had participated in the Tesseran Commodity Exhibition across its 900-year history. Humans had participated in exactly none. Their delegation had been admitted as observers 4 cycles ago, upgraded to provisional trading status 2 cycles ago, and had now, through some procedural mechanism that no one in the commissary fully understood, secured a demonstrator slot in the exhibition's 7-round qualifying sequence. The chair was empty because the human delegation's chief negotiator had declined the invitation to the pre-exhibition banquet, a small discourtesy that the commissary had barely registered. Humans did that. They declined things. They sent polite notes explaining scheduling conflicts that everyone understood were fictional. They were easy to overlook, which was, in the general opinion of the commissary, the most accurate thing one could say about humanity's contribution to interstellar commerce. Croche sipped from her goblet. The mineral-infused water caught the banquet hall's chandelier light and refracted it across the polished granite table in patterns that mirrored the amusement on her face. Beside her, Commissar Tethek, her deputy, a compact Vethani male whose specialty was derivatives pricing, and whose hobby was cataloging the failures of lesser trading partners, leaned toward the observer from the Koreth Dominion, and said something that made the Koreth's armored head tilt in what passed for shared laughter among a species that had no visible mouth. The Koreth observer's name was Fleet Assessor Rule. His presence at the banquet was technically unofficial. His presence at the exhibition the following day would be technically non-existent. The Koreth Dominion did not acknowledge interest in new trading partners until those partners had proven themselves interesting, and humans, by the consensus of 600 years of Koreth institutional memory, were not. 3 levels below the commissary, in a cargo bay that smelled of coolant and packing foam, the human delegation's chief negotiator sat cross-legged on the floor eating a protein bar that tasted of compressed ambition and artificial lemon. Her name was Marin Holt. She was 46 years old, broad-shouldered, with short dark hair that she cut herself because salons were an inefficient use of time. Her suit jacket was draped over a shipping container behind her. Her shoes were off. She was reading yield projections on Helion-7 mineral extraction and making notes in a margin with a stylus she had taken from a Drenathi trade office 6 months ago. She did not consider this theft. She considered it field research into Drenathi supply chain attitudes, one of which was that they left styluses lying around. Around her, the rest of the human trade delegation, all 4 of them, occupied various positions on the cargo bay floor in similar states of professional focus and relative undress. Fen Adami, the delegation's data analyst, sat against a bulkhead with 2 tablets propped on her knees, cross-referencing Concourse tariff schedules. She was 31, precise in a way that made other analysts look careless, and she was monitoring the banquet's public broadcast feed on a secondary display, because information was information regardless of its source. Duro Kane, the logistics officer, was organizing the reference case, a matte black container that held, instead of the data drives and projection units that other delegations brought, printed sheets of paper. Duro was 53, quietly methodical, and had spent the past 4 months printing, collating, and indexing every publicly available dataset that the Concourse's member species had ever published. He had a system. The system involved colored tabs and an index that he kept in his head. Priya Nair, the youngest member at 27, was the delegation's commodities specialist, though her actual role was closer to intelligence analyst. She had spent the past 2 years studying Vethani nonverbal communication patterns from observation gallery recordings, cataloging the minute shifts in mandibular plate position that distinguished Vethani amusement from Vethani concern from Vethani genuine alarm. She could read Krosh's face better than most Vethani could. "Krosh just toasted you," Fen said, not looking up from her tariff schedules. "Called your contribution brief. Got a good laugh." "What kind of laugh?" "Comfortable." "Good." Fen waited. Marin did not elaborate. Fen had worked with her for 3 years and had learned that Marin's silences were not pauses. They were completed thoughts that she did not consider worth unpacking aloud. Duro pulled a tabbed section from the reference case and set it beside Marin's knee. "Resonance crystal auction data," he said. 600 years of price history, sorted by buyer dependency. All 600. All 600. Tesseran Public Archives. They publish everything. I don't think anyone's ever read the early records. Marin picked up the section and scanned the first page. She ate the last bite of her protein bar, folded the wrapper into a precise square, and set it aside. They will now. The Tesseran Commodity Exhibition was not, despite its name, primarily about commodities. It was about valuation. Every species in the concourse of settled commerce valued goods differently. The Vethani priced everything against strategic scarcity. How rare is it? How hard is it to replace? Who else has it? The Drenathi priced against labor hour equivalents. How many workers? How many hours? What is the opportunity cost? The Koreth priced against territorial leverage. What does controlling this buy you in terms of space and influence? Each species pricing model was a reflection of its deepest economic philosophy, refined over centuries of trade, and each species believed, with the quiet certainty of long experience, that its model was the most sophisticated. The exhibition's 7-round qualifying sequence was the mechanism by which a new trading partner demonstrated that it understood valuation at a level sophisticated enough to participate in the concourse's exchange systems. 7 rounds, 7 commodity parcels. In each round, the demonstrating delegation received a sealed parcel and was given 40 minutes to produce a valuation assessment, a proposed exchange rate, and a market placement strategy. The assessment was evaluated by the exhibition's 12-member pricing tribunal, drawn from the concourse's most senior trade houses. A passing score on 4 of 7 rounds earned qualifying status. 6 earned preferred trading access. No species in the exhibition's 900-year history had passed all 7 on its first attempt. The Vethani had passed 5 on their first try, the standing record. It had taken them 3 additional cycles to clear the remaining 2, a process that involved retaining 37 senior assessors, 12 supplementary analysts, and a legal team of 9. They had been trading in the concourse for 400 years and considered this record a point of institutional pride so settled that it no longer required defending. Marin Holt had been given a demonstrator's slot because a procedural clause in the concourse's charter allowed any provisional trading partner to request one after 2 cycles of observer status. The clause existed because no one had ever expected anyone to use it. It was the commercial equivalent of a fire exit in a building that had never burned down. She used it. The morning of the exhibition, the commissary of trade was configured for spectacle. The main hall of the Tesseran Exchange was a vast elliptical chamber with seating for 300 delegates, tiered in concentric rings around a central demonstration floor of polished obsidian. The pricing tribunal sat in an elevated gallery on the far wall, 12 figures representing the concourse's 12 founding trade houses, their chairs arranged in a precise arc that suggested both judgment and attention. The chamber was climate-controlled to the mean comfort range of 17 species, acoustically tuned so that a whisper on the demonstration floor could be heard in the gallery, and designed, in every dimension, to make whoever stood at the center feel like they were performing for a civilization. The Vethani delegation occupied the prime seating block directly facing the demonstration floor. Krosh sat in the front row, her crystalline formal attire catching the chamber's diffused lighting in patterns that shifted with her posture, an effect that was partly aesthetic and partly communicative, since the Vethani used light refraction in formal dress the way some species used facial expression. She was flanked by Tethik, already running preliminary models on his data tablet, and by Fleet Assessor Rule, whose official position was that he was not there and whose actual position was front row center. Marin Holt walked onto the demonstration floor at exactly the scheduled time, carrying nothing except a single data tablet. Behind her, Fen Adami carried a second tablet. Behind Fen, Duro Kane carried the reference case. The fourth member of the team, Priya Nair, took a seat in the observer's gallery with a clear sightline to Krosh's block. Her job was to watch the watchers. Marin stood on the obsidian floor and looked up at the pricing tribunal. She nodded once. She did not bow. 300 delegates noted this. Most interpreted it as ignorance of protocol. A few, the more experienced ones, interpreted it as a choice. The tribunal's senior adjudicator, a Dranathi matriarch named Vesk, whose formal title translated roughly to "she who weighs," opened the proceedings with the traditional invocation and gestured for the first parcel. Round 1. The sealed parcel was delivered to the demonstration floor by automated transport, a standard gauge container bearing the Concourse's verification seal. Marin broke the seal, examined the lot certification, a standardized quantity of refined helium-7, a mineral compound used in energy cell fabrication across 17 species industrial bases, and passed the documentation to Fen. A common commodity, a simple opening round designed to establish baseline competence. The expected approach was to price it against the Concourse's standard scarcity index, the benchmark that every species used and every assessor learned in their first year of training. Demonstrate that you can read the index, apply the multiplier, and produce a defensible number. Elementary. Fen ran numbers on her tablet. Duro opened the reference case and pulled a single sheet of printed data. The paper drew a murmur from the gallery. Several delegates leaned toward their neighbors. Paper. Humans had brought paper. 40 minutes. Marin used 11. She presented to the tribunal a valuation assessment that priced the helium-7 not against the scarcity index, but against consumption rate differentials across the 17 species that used it. Species that consumed helium-7 at high volumes but could substitute alternatives were assigned a lower per unit value than species that consumed less but had no substitutes. The price she proposed was 14% lower than the Concourse benchmark. The gallery stirred. Krosh's mandibular plates were still. Tethik leaned forward and began entering numbers into his own tablet. The tribunal deliberated for 6 minutes. Adjudicator Vesk announced the score, passing. The assessment was noted as unconventional but defensible. The consumption rate methodology was flagged for review. No one applauded. The round was too simple to warrant it, and the methodology was too strange to invite approval. But no one laughed either. That was the first small shift. The comfortable laughter of the banquet had been possible because the humans were an abstraction, a minor species filing paperwork. Now they were on the floor, and the first assessment had been competent in a way that did not fit the expected pattern. Round 2. The parcel contained a mixed lot, industrial-grade polymers sourced from 3 different extraction zones, each with different regulatory classifications under 3 different species trade frameworks. A complexity test. The challenge was not pricing the polymers themselves, but navigating the regulatory overlay. 3 zones meant 3 tariff schedules, 3 compliance frameworks, and 3 potential arbitrage opportunities that a sophisticated trader would identify and a novice would miss. Marin identified 4. The 4th arbitrage opportunity was one the tribunal had not included in its scoring rubric. It existed in the gap between 2 regulatory frameworks that had been drafted by different species at different times, and never reconciled a Drenathi labor hour exemption that technically applied to polymer feedstocks, but had never been cross-referenced against the Concourse territorial surcharge on goods transiting the same extraction zone. The exemption and the surcharge canceled each other under specific conditions that no one had apparently noticed in the 2 centuries, since both frameworks had been in effect. Marin's assessment noted the gap, priced the opportunity, and proposed a market placement that exploited it without violating either framework. The gallery was quiet. Tethik had stopped entering numbers into his own tablet and was now reading the human assessment on the chamber's projection display with the fixed attention of someone checking a sum they had been certain about and finding it wrong. Fleet Assessor Rule, who was not officially there, had leaned forward in his seat. Tribunal score, passing. Adjudicator Vesk asked Marin to explain her methodology for identifying the 4th opportunity. We read the tariff schedules, Marin said. All species read the tariff schedules, Vesk said. We read all of them together, at the same time, cross-referenced against each other. A pause. Vesk made a note. In the gallery, 2 tribunal members exchanged a glance that the 300 delegates could not quite interpret. Round 3. Bioengineered nutrient stock. A commodity with wildly variable value depending on species-specific dietary requirements. The Vethani could not digest it. The Concourse considered it a luxury supplement. The Drenathi used it as industrial feedstock for biopolymer production. Pricing it required understanding not just what the commodity was, but what it meant to each potential buyer, a different calculation for each of the 31 species in the concourse. Marin's team took 18 minutes. Her assessment segmented the lot into 7 microparcels, each priced for a different buyer species based on nutritional utility rather than bulk weight. A kilogram of nutrient stock destined for a Concourse luxury market was priced differently than the same kilogram destined for Drenathi industrial processing, because the value each species derived from the same physical substance was fundamentally different. The total valuation was 23% higher than a single lot assessment would have produced. Tethik stopped running his own models. He put his data tablet face down on his knee and watched the demonstration floor with the expression of someone recalculating not a number but a category. Tribunal score, passing. The microparcel strategy was noted as highly irregular but commercially sound. One tribunal member asked whether the human delegation had prior experience with nutrient stock trading. No, Marin said. Then how did you determine species-specific nutritional utility values? Published dietary surveys. 16 species published their nutritional requirements in their public health databases. We compiled them. All 16. 31, actually. 16 were relevant to this parcel. The gallery murmured. It was a different murmur than before. The earlier murmurs had been curiosity. This one had a thread of something else running through it, a faint vibration of recalculation, as if 300 professionals were simultaneously adjusting an internal ledger they had thought was already balanced. In the observer's gallery, Priya Nair was watching Krosh. Krosh's mandibular plates were locked in a neutral position, which, in Vethani body language, was the equivalent of a poker face. The kind of expression a Vethani wore when their actual reaction was not suitable for public display. Priya had seen this configuration exactly twice in her 2 years of study. Both times, the Vethani in question had been receiving information that required a fundamental reassessment of a position they had held for a long time. Round 4. The parcel was unusual. It contained not a physical commodity but a service contract. a 15-cycle maintenance agreement for orbital docking infrastructure, the kind of long-duration commercial instrument that required projecting costs, risks, and counterparty behavior across decades. Service contracts were the exhibition's filter round. Physical commodities had observable properties, weight, purity, regulatory classification. Service contracts had none of these. They were pure valuation exercises, dependent entirely on the assessor's ability to see the future clearly enough to price the present accurately. Most first-time demonstrators failed round 4. The Vethani had failed it on their first attempt. The standard approach was to project costs based on the infrastructure's known maintenance requirements, apply a risk premium for equipment degradation, and produce a flat annual rate. It was safe. It was defensible. It was also, by Marin's calculation, wrong. Her team took 31 minutes, the longest of any round so far. Duro pulled 4 sheets of printed data from the reference case. Fen ran projections on both tablets simultaneously, her fingers moving across the displays with the practiced speed of someone who had rehearsed these calculations in a cargo bay at 2 in the morning. Marin stood at the center of the demonstration floor and did not look at the gallery once. Her assessment valued the service contract using a framework the tribunal had not seen before. She called it counterparty endurance modeling. Instead of projecting costs based on what the infrastructure needed, she projected them based on whether the entity paying for the maintenance would still be able to pay. Her model tracked the counterparty's economic trajectory, revenue sources, sector exposure, competitive pressures, and predicted that its ability to meet contract obligations would decline in cycles 7 through 9 due to a sector-wide contraction in the docking industry that the available data strongly suggested was coming. The contract's real value was front-loaded. She priced accordingly, higher rates in the early cycles when the counterparty could pay, lower in the later cycles when it could not, with a renegotiation clause triggered by a specific economic indicator that would serve as an early warning system for both parties. The tribunal deliberated for 14 minutes. This was longer than any previous deliberation in this exhibition cycle. Adjudicator Vesk, Ms. Holt. Your model assumes that the counterparty's economic trajectory is predictable. Within a range. What range? Plus or minus 8% over the contract's duration, sufficient for pricing purposes, insufficient for certainty, which is why the renegotiation clause exists. No assessor in this exhibition's history has attempted to model counterparty economic trajectory as a primary pricing variable. That seems like an oversight. Vesk looked at her. The silence lasted 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, several things happened in the gallery that Priya Nair documented from her observation post. Krosh's mandibular plates shifted from neutral lock to a configuration Priya's notes would later describe as controlled reappraisal. Tethic's data tablet was face down and stayed face down. Fleet Assessor Rule had stopped pretending to be disinterested. Vesk made a note. Tribunal score, passing. The gallery exhaled. Not all of it. Not the Vethani block, which remained perfectly still. But the delegates in the middle tiers, the minor trading partners and provisional observers, released a collective breath that carried 4 rounds of accumulated surprise. 4 rounds, 4 passes. The minimum qualifying threshold had been met. Marin Holt could stop now. She could accept provisional qualifying status, leave the demonstration floor with a clean record, and spend the next several cycles building a conventional trading portfolio. It was the expected move, the smart move. The move that said, we are new, we are cautious, we will grow slowly and prove ourselves over time. She did not stop. Krosh in the front row shifted. Her crystalline attire caught the light differently. Her mandibular plates unlocked for the first time in 2 rounds, settling into a pattern that Priya identified as reassessment. Not concern, not alarm, something more fundamental, the expression of someone whose model of the situation was no longer producing accurate predictions. Round 5. The parcel was a strategic commodity, tesseract resonance crystals, used in faster-than-light communication arrays across every major trading species in the Concourse. The tesseract exchange controlled the supply. The Concourse set the price through a managed auction system that had operated, with minor adjustments, for 600 years. The crystals were what the Concourse called a heritage commodity, priced by tradition and political agreement as much as by supply and demand. This was the round that exposed outsiders. Heritage commodities could not be priced by data alone. Their value was embedded in centuries of trade relationships, political accommodations, and the cultural significance that different species attached to the materials they depended on. A newcomer who priced heritage commodities like any other good would reveal, publicly and irreversibly, that they did not understand the Concourse's deeper architecture, the invisible agreements beneath the visible markets. Marin looked at the parcel. She looked at her team. Fen shook her head slightly, which meant the data models were not going to be sufficient by themselves. Duro pulled 2 printed sheets from the reference case, the 600-year auction history he had compiled. Marin read them. She read them the way a structural engineer reads blueprints, not for the building as designed, but for the stresses the design created. The gallery watched, Krosh watched, Rule watched. Marin's assessment priced the resonance crystals using 2 parallel frameworks presented side by side. The first was conventional, scarcity-adjusted, supply chain weighted, consistent with 600 years of auction precedent. Respectful, correct, dull. The second was new. She presented it as an annotation, not a replacement, a distinction that several tribunal members would later describe as surgically diplomatic. She called it dependency-weighted valuation. The dependency-weighted framework did not price the crystals based on what they were. It priced them based on what would happen to each buyer species if the supply disappeared. The tesserans, who controlled the supply, had zero dependency. The Vethani, whose entire communication infrastructure relied on the crystals for 73% of its faster-than-light capacity, had maximum dependency. The Korath, who had quietly developed an alternative technology 3 decades ago, had almost none. The crystals were the same crystals regardless of who bought them. But the cost of losing access to them was radically different for each buyer. Marin's annotation proposed that the Concourse acknowledge this dependency gradient as a relevant variable in future pricing discussions. And she noted, with the flatness of someone stating a mathematical fact, that a commodity whose price did not reflect its buyer-specific criticality was a commodity whose price was incomplete. The gallery went quiet, not the productive quiet of concentration. The airless quiet of 300 professionals realizing simultaneously that someone had just said something true that no one had ever said before. Krosh's mandibular plates locked. Tethik put his data tablet down. Fleet Assessor Rule sat back in his seat, with the deliberateness of someone who needed a moment to process. Tribunal deliberation, 19 minutes. Adjudicator Vesk, Ms. Holt, you are aware that your dependency-weighted annotation suggests that the Vethani mercantile sovereignty has been paying a structurally inflated price for resonance crystals for approximately 300 years. The annotation suggests that the pricing model doesn't account for buyer-specific criticality. The implications for any individual buyer are a matter for bilateral negotiation, not for this exhibition. You are being diplomatic. I am being precise. Vesk looked at the tribunal. The tribunal looked at each other. A Korath member tilted its head in a gesture that the gallery interpreted as either surprise or amusement. Given that the Korath had independently developed crystal alternative technology, and therefore had the lowest dependency in the room, the amusement was well-founded. Tribunal score, passing. The dependency-weighted annotation was noted as significant. The word significant had not appeared in a tribunal notation in 4 exhibition cycles. 5 passes out of 5. In the Vethani block, Krosh did not move, Tethic did not move, but the quality of their stillness changed. They had come to the exhibition expecting to watch a minor species stumble through a procedural formality. What they were watching now had no comfortable category. The recalibration required to process the shift was visible not in any expression or gesture, but in the precision of their immobility, the careful stillness of people whose assumptions were being rebuilt while they sat in them. Priya Nair sent a brief message to Marin's tablet from the gallery. Krosh is locked. Tethic stopped running numbers 2 rounds ago. The Koreth observer has been signaling his delegation since round 3. 14 other delegations have sent messages during the last deliberation. Marin read the message. She did not react. Round 6. The parcel was a test of something the tribunal called composite integration. It contained a mixed portfolio, mineral rights in an active extraction zone, a shipping contract for bulk transport, an insurance obligation covering operational risk, and a cultural artifact, a Tesseran ceremonial object classified as a heritage item with restricted transfer conditions. The challenge was to value the entire portfolio as a single integrated instrument, not 4 separate values added together. One value that accounted for how the 4 components interacted, how each one's worth was changed by the presence of the others. This was the round that had stopped the Vethani for 3 cycles. Not because the Vethani lacked sophistication, they were arguably the most technically skilled traders in the concourse, but because composite integration required a specific form of lateral thinking that their scarcity-driven pricing model was not designed to produce. Each component had a clear individual value. The portfolio's integrated value was not the sum of those values. It was something different, something that emerged from the relationships between components, and the Vethani model did not have a mechanism for pricing relationships. Marin's team took 37 minutes, the longest round. Finn worked both tablets. Duro emptied the reference case, laying out every remaining printed sheet on the obsidian floor in an arrangement that looked, from the gallery, like a map of something only the human delegation could read. Marin stood at the center of the floor and thought. She thought visibly, in a way that the gallery found either impressive or uncomfortable depending on their species' relationship to silence and stillness. The Drenathi found it unremarkable. The Vethani found it alarming. A trader who thought in public in their experience was either very confident or very lost, and both possibilities were concerning. Her assessment valued the portfolio using a relational model. She identified 7 points of interaction between the 4 components and priced each interaction as a separate variable. The mineral rights affected the shipping contract's route efficiency extraction. Closer to shipping lanes reduced transport costs. The insurance obligations premium was modulated by the mineral rights extraction risk profile. Riskier extraction meant higher coverage costs. The cultural artifact's heritage status affected the insurance obligations underwriting framework, because heritage items required specialized coverage that limited the pool of available underwriters. The 7th interaction was the one that changed the room. The cultural artifact, as a Tesseran heritage item, could not be legally separated from the portfolio and sold independently. Heritage transfer restrictions prevented it. This meant the artifact had no independent market, it could only change hands as part of the portfolio, and that constraint affected the portfolio's liquidity. A buyer who acquired this portfolio could sell the mineral rights, renegotiate the shipping contract, restructure the insurance, but the artifact had to stay. It was an anchor, and anchors had a cost. Marin assigned a negative value to the artifact's presence in the portfolio. Not because the artifact was culturally worthless, she was explicit about this distinction, but because its presence reduced the portfolio's flexibility by a measurable amount. The flexibility cost was the price of being unable to restructure freely. The gallery was very quiet. Several delegates had stopped whispering 3 minutes ago and had not resumed. The tribunal's faces were professionally neutral, but adjudicator Vesk's note-taking had accelerated visibly, her stylus moving across her tablet in the quick, purposeful strokes of someone documenting something she expected to be cited. Tribunal deliberation, 22 minutes, the longest in the history of this exhibition cycle. Adjudicator Vesk: Ms. Holt, you have assigned a negative value to a Tesseract ceremonial heritage item. I have assigned a negative value to a liquidity constraint. The heritage item is the mechanism of the constraint, but the constraint itself is the variable I priced. Several members of this tribunal find the distinction elegant. Others find it provocative. It is intended to be accurate. You are aware that no prior demonstrator has separated the concept of a heritage item's cultural value from its portfolio impact. I am. How? Because if someone had done it before, the Concourse's composite pricing models would already account for it. They don't. Vesk looked at her for a long time. Then the adjudicator wrote a note that was longer than any previous note in the proceedings. In the gallery, one tribunal member, a Tesseract, whose species had created the heritage classification system, was perfectly still. Later, Priya would learn that this particular tribunal member had requested a copy of Marin's assessment before the deliberation was complete, a procedural irregularity that Vesk had quietly permitted. Tribunal score: passing. 6 passes, 6 of 7, equal to the Vethani's first attempt record, the record that had stood for 400 years, set by a delegation of 37 senior assessors with centuries of institutional backing, matched in one morning by 4 people, 2 data tablets, and a case of printed paper. Krosh stood up. The gesture was controlled, deliberate, and visible to the entire chamber. Standing during a demonstration round was a breach of spectator protocol, not a serious one, but a notable one. It meant the delegate considered the proceedings significant enough to warrant a physical response, and Krosh was not a delegate who made physical responses lightly. Tethik looked at Krosh. Krosh looked at the demonstration floor. Her mandibular plates were in a configuration that Priya had never seen documented in any Vethani communication study. She would spend 6 months researching it afterward, and would eventually conclude that the configuration did not have a direct translation in any of the Concourse's 14 trade languages. The closest approximation, assembled from 3 different Vethani cultural references, was something between "I was wrong" and "I am watching someone who matters." Round 7. The final round of the 7-round qualifying sequence was, by tradition, the tribunal's choice. The sealed parcel was selected by the adjudicator based on the demonstrator's performance in the previous 6 rounds. It was designed to test the specific area where the demonstrator appeared weakest, the crack in the foundation, the gap that 6 strong rounds might be concealing. Adjudicator Vesk opened the 7th parcel personally. She descended from the tribunal gallery, the first time she had left her seat all day, and placed the container on the demonstration floor with the care of someone handling something that mattered. She opened the container. It was empty. Not symbolically empty, physically empty. The container held nothing, no commodity, no contract, no rights. No obligations, no artifact. Marin looked at the empty container. She looked at Vesk. 300 delegates looked at both of them. The 7th round, Vesk said, is a valuation of nothing. Price the absence of a commodity. Tell the tribunal what something is worth when there is nothing there. The gallery shifted. The delegates who recognized the test, the senior traders, the institutional historians, the species who had participated in the exhibition for centuries, drew back slightly in their seats. This was the valuation of absence. It had been given to 3 demonstrators in the exhibition's 900-year history. None had passed it. The test was considered, among the Concourse's trade houses, not a test at all but a philosophical provocation, a problem without a solution, deployed when the tribunal wanted to remind a demonstrator that mastery had limits. The Vethani delegation was motionless. Krosh remained standing. This was not a test of methodology or data or clever frameworks. This was a test of whether the demonstrator understood valuation itself not as a set of techniques applied to objects, but as a way of seeing the world. Marin looked at the empty container for 11 seconds. She did not consult her team. She did not check her tablet. Fen and Duro sat behind her with the patient stillness of people who had seen her think before and knew what the silence meant. She turned to the tribunal. "The absence of a commodity has a specific, measurable value," she said. "It is the value of the expectation that the commodity would be present." She paused. The chamber was silent. Every entity in this chamber arrived today expecting a 7th parcel containing a tradable good. Shipping schedules, warehousing allocations, and preliminary purchase authorizations have been structured around that expectation. Port authorities have reserved docking berths. Insurance underwriters have drafted provisional coverage. Customs agents have staffed processing stations. The commodity does not exist, but the infrastructure built to receive it does. The absence of the commodity does not eliminate those commitments, it redirects them. She stepped closer to the empty container. The value of nothing in this context is the cost of rearranging every plan that was built around something. That cost is distributed across every entity in the supply chain that expected the commodity to arrive. It is highest for the entity with the least flexibility, the entity that committed the most resources to the expectation and has the fewest alternatives. It is lowest for the entity with the most flexibility. She turned to the gallery. She looked directly at Krosh. The value of nothing is the price of being unable to adapt. The silence in the chamber had a physical quality. It pressed against the walls. Marin returned her attention to the tribunal. "My assessment values the absence at the weighted average adaptation, cost across the 12 most likely commodity types that this parcel could have contained, adjusted for the probability distribution of each type based on the exhibition's historical 7th round selections. The resulting figure represents what this room collectively lost by having nothing in the box." She named the figure. It was specific, defensible, and not round. It ended in decimals. It was the kind of number that could only be produced by someone who had done the math before walking into the room. Fen Ademi, seated behind her, did not look up from her tablet. She had already verified the number. She had verified it in the cargo bay at 3 o'clock that morning, working from Duro's printed historical data, because Marin had told her 6 weeks ago that the 7th round might be empty. Tribunal deliberation, 31 minutes. When adjudicator Vesk returned, she did not announce the score immediately. She stood at the edge of the tribunal gallery and looked at Marin Holt, standing alone on the obsidian floor with her single tablet and her stockinged feet, and her expression of mild professional patience. "Ms. Holt," Vesk said, "in 900 years, no demonstrator has passed all 7 rounds on their first attempt. 3 demonstrators have received the valuation of absence. None have passed. Your assessment is the first to identify adaptation cost as the pricing mechanism for absence. It is also the first to arrive with the calculation already prepared." A pause. "The tribunal score is passing." The chamber did not erupt. It did not applaud wildly or gasp in theatrical shock. This was the concourse of settled commerce, and its delegates were professionals with centuries of institutional composure. What happened was smaller and more significant. 300 delegates adjusted their understanding of what humans were, not all at once, not with a single collective realization, but in 300 individual, private recalculations, conducted simultaneously, visible only in the subtle shifts of posture and breath and attention that indicated a room full of experts absorbing a result they had not predicted and could not dismiss. In the second tier, a Tesseran trade historian named Orth turned to his colleague and said very quietly that he had been attending the exhibition for 42 cycles and had never once seen a demonstrator anticipate the 7th round. His colleague did not respond. She was replaying Marin's assessment on her data tablet, isolating the adaptation cost framework, running her own numbers against it. Her numbers matched. She closed the tablet and sat very still for a moment, which was her version of the same recalculation that 300 other professionals were conducting around her. In the Drenathi block, 2 senior assessors were having a conversation in rapid low-frequency tonal shifts that the chamber's translation systems did not pick up because it was conducted below the official communication threshold. The conversation was brief. Its content, translated loosely, was, "She prepared for the empty box." Yes. How? She read us, all of us. She built a model of what we would do and priced the result before we did it. A pause. That is not a trade skill. That is a strategic capability. Another pause longer. Yes. The Korath delegation, the official one, not Rule, who continued to be technically absent, had stopped communicating entirely. Among the Korath, silence was not the absence of communication. It was the most intense form of it. A Korath delegation that went silent was a delegation processing information at the institutional level, routing data through decision frameworks that operated below conscious discussion. The silence would last for approximately 40 minutes, after which they would produce a consensus assessment that would be forwarded to the Korath Dominion's Strategic Trade Council. The assessment would be classified. Its classification level would be higher than any previous assessment concerning humans. Krosh remained standing. She had been standing since round 6. Her mandibular plates settled into the configuration that Priya would study for 6 months and would eventually conclude was the Vethani equivalent of open respect, the expression, a master trader reserved for another master trader, regardless of species, regardless of history, regardless of the comfortable laughter at the banquet the night before. Adjudicator Vesk stepped down from the tribunal gallery for the second time. She walked to the demonstration floor, stopped in front of Marin, and extended her hand in the human gesture. It was not a gesture the Drenathi used. Vesk had learned it specifically for this moment, which meant she had been considering the possibility of this moment for some time. "Welcome to the Concourse, Ms. Holt." Marin shook her hand. Her grip was firm and brief. "Thank you, Adjudicator. How long has your delegation been preparing for this?" 2 years. How many analysts? 4. The Vethani used 37 for their first attempt. The Drenathi used 52. We used what we had. Vesk held her gaze for a moment. Then the adjudicator returned to the gallery, and the session was formally closed. The chamber did not empty quickly. Normally, after a demonstration, even a successful one, the delegates filed out with the efficient purposefulness of professionals returning to work that the proceedings had interrupted. Schedules resumed. Lunches were taken. The exhibition was an event, but it was a scheduled event, and the concourse ran on schedules. This time, delegates lingered. They lingered the way people do when they have just seen something that their existing categories cannot accommodate, and they need to talk about it before they can leave the room. Small clusters formed in the tiered, seating 2 Drenathi assessors comparing notes with a Tesseran cultural liaison, a group of minor species observers speaking in careful undertones, 3 Korath functionaries conducting what appeared to be a standing debrief in the aisle between the 4th and 5th tiers. The conversations followed a pattern. They began with the specific, a particular round, a particular number, a particular phrase that Marin had used, and quickly moved to the general. The general was harder. The general was the question of what the morning's results meant for the assumptions that had organized 6 centuries of commerce. Every species in the concourse had built its trading architecture on the belief that its own valuation model was the most complete. What the human delegation had demonstrated across 7 rounds was that completeness was relative, that every model was a lens, and every lens had edges, and humans had spent 2 years mapping those edges in every direction simultaneously. One conversation between a Tessaran heritage trade specialist and a Vethani junior assessor captured the essential problem in a single exchange that the junior assessor would remember for the rest of her career. They did not use our model, the specialist said. They did not use anyone's model. They used all the models at once, and then they used the gaps between them. Is that legal? The junior assessor asked. It was a genuine question. She had been trained in Vethani scarcity-based pricing, trained to believe that the discipline of a single coherent framework was the foundation of rigorous valuation. What the humans had done looked, from the inside of that framework, like cheating. Not because it broke any rule, because it broke the assumption that rules were enough. Legal is not the issue, the specialist said. The issue is that they saw what we were standing on, and they priced it. In the corridor outside the main hall, the human delegation packed their reference case. Duro folded the printed data sheets, stacked them neatly, and placed them in a recycling slot. Fen powered down both tablets and tucked them into their cases with the care of a mechanic storing tools. Priya descended from the observer's gallery with 3 pages of Vethani body language notes that would, in time, become a monograph cited by 4 different species diplomatic training programs. Marin put her shoes back on. Krosh appeared in the corridor. She had left the Vethani block, a departure that was itself a statement, since delegation prefects did not wander corridors after formal proceedings. She was accompanied by Tethik, whose data tablet was finally back in his hands, and by Fleet Assessor Rule, who was still technically not there, but who had apparently decided that this was an event worth being not there for in person. Ms. Holt. Delegate Prefect. Krosh's mandibular plates shifted. I owe you a correction. At the banquet, I described your contribution as brief. You did. It was not brief. No. Krosh studied her for a moment. The dependency-weighted annotation. In round 5, you identified a structural pricing asymmetry in a heritage commodity market that has operated for 600 years. An asymmetry that 31 species, including my own, have been living inside without seeing it. The asymmetry was there. We just looked at it from the buyer's side. No one looks at it from the buyer's side. The Concourse's pricing models are seller-originated. That is the foundation of 6 centuries of trade architecture. Traditions are not data. Krosh's mandibular plates clicked, not the comfortable amusement of the banquet, something sharper and more precise, something that acknowledged the cutting edge of the statement without attempting to dull it. The Vethani mercantile sovereignty would like to propose a bilateral trade consultation with the Earth delegation. Formal, principal level. We believe there are several areas where our respective analytical approaches might produce results that neither could achieve alone. Marin considered this for exactly 3 seconds. We would be glad to participate. You have 4 analysts. We do. The Vethani consultation delegation consists of 41 senior assessors, 12 legal advisors, and a supporting staff of 109. That sounds thorough. You are not concerned by the asymmetry. Marin picked up the reference case. It was lighter now, empty of the printed sheets that had done their work. She tucked the data tablet under her arm with the unself-conscious efficiency of someone for whom the tool had become an extension of the hand. Delegate Prefect, our entire methodology is built on understanding asymmetries, yours in particular. Krosh looked at her. The chamber behind them was emptying, delegates filing out in the orderly procession of a concourse whose understanding of humanity had just been rebuilt in 7 rounds. Somewhere in the commissary 3 levels above, the banquet staff were clearing the remnants of last night's celebration, the goblets, the ceremonial place settings, the chair that had been left empty for the negotiator who had not come to the party, because she had been sitting on a cargo bay floor, eating a protein bar, reading 600 years of crystal auction data. "I believe," Krosh said, "that we underestimated you." Marin nodded. It was a small gesture, professional, entirely without triumph. The human who had just broken a 900-year record did not gloat, did not smile, did not deliver a speech about what the moment meant. She nodded the way a tradesperson acknowledges a fair assessment. "Most people do," she said. "We price that in." She walked down the corridor. Her team followed. 4 people, 2 tablets, and an empty reference case, heading back to the cargo bay 3 levels below the commissary, where the protein bars and the data and the next problem were waiting. They passed 3 other delegations on the way to the lift. The first, a Tesseran trade group of 12, stepped aside with a deference that was not quite bowing, but was unmistakably an acknowledgement. The second, a pair of Drenathi commercial attaches, watched them pass with the focused attention of analysts studying a phenomenon they intended to report on in detail. The third was a single delegate from a minor species called the Soon, who had been provisional trading partners for 6 cycles and had never moved beyond provisional status. She watched Marin's team walk past and then stood in the corridor for a long time, holding a data tablet that still displayed the exhibition's scoring summary, doing math that had nothing to do with commodities. In the lift, Fen broke the silence. 14 delegations sent formal consultation requests during the last 3 rounds. I flagged them. 6 are from species with strategic commodity access we could use. 3 are from species who probably want to figure out how we did it. The other 5 are genuine. "Sort by leverage," Marin said. "Respond to the genuine ones first. Not the high leverage ones. The genuine ones become high leverage once they realize we answered them first." Fen considered this for 2 seconds. Then she began drafting responses. Duro leaned against the lift wall and closed the empty reference case with a definitive click. He did not say anything, but the expression on his face, the expression of a 53-year-old logistics officer who had spent 4 months printing, collating, and indexing every publicly available dataset in the Concourse's history, was the expression of a man who understood that the work had been the weapon, and the weapon had been sufficient. Priya was reading her body language notes. She had filled 7 additional pages during the final 3 rounds. "Rule composed 3 messages during your 7th round assessment," she said without looking up. "The first was short. The second was long. The third was sent to a distribution list. He used priority encryption on the third one." Distribution list. I counted the routing indicators, 7 recipients. That's consistent with the Korath, Dominion's inner strategic council. Marin absorbed this. She ate another protein bar the second of the day, identical to the first, consumed with the same mechanical efficiency of a person who considered food fuel and not an experience. "Good," she said. The lift opened. The cargo bay was as they had left it, coolant-scented, cluttered with packing foam, lit by the flat industrial lighting of a space designed for objects, not performances. Marin sat on the same shipping container she had used that morning, pulled off her shoes for the second time, and opened her data tablet. The tablet's notification queue contained 43 items. Consultation requests, information inquiries, interview solicitations from 3 separate Concourse media outlets, and a single message from the Tesseran Exchange's administrative office formally confirming the Earth delegation's qualification results and preferred trading access status. The message was procedural. The language was boilerplate, but it was the kind of boilerplate that opened doors: trading floor access, settlement clearance, counterparty verification rights. The infrastructure of participation, delivered in 14 lines of form text. Marin read it, noted it, and set it aside. She opened Fenn's tariff analysis from the previous evening and began marking up the sections that would need revision now that preferred trading access had changed their regulatory position. The next problem, always the next problem. Behind them, 3 levels up, the commissary of trade was experiencing something it had not experienced in institutional memory. The post-exhibition reception, a routine social function that typically lasted 90 minutes and featured polite conversation about procedural matters, had transformed into something that more closely resembled an emergency strategy session. Delegations that normally occupied separate social orbits were mingling. Species that conducted business through formal intermediaries were speaking directly. The topic of every conversation, conducted in 11 different languages and 3 nonverbal communication systems, was the same. The humans. Not humans as they had been understood that morning, a minor species with a provisional trading slot and an inexplicable fondness for paper. Humans as they had been revealed across 7 rounds, something else entirely. Something that read every data source simultaneously, cross-referenced every framework against every other framework, and found the gaps that 600 years of sophisticated commerce had been generating without noticing. The Drenathi Trade Delegation sent a formal request to their Home Governance Council, recommending that the Drenathi Collective's human engagement protocols be upgraded from Category 7 Minor Trading Partner, Minimal Strategic Significance, to Category 3. Category 3 was reserved for entities whose commercial capabilities had direct implications for Drenathi economic security. The last species upgraded to Category 3 had been the Korath, 90 years ago, after the Korath had independently developed faster-than-light communication technology and broken the Tesseran crystal monopoly. The Drenathi Trade Delegation's chief assessor noted in her report that the humans had not broken any monopoly. They had done something more significant. They had demonstrated the ability to see monopolies from the inside, to price the dependencies they created, and to make the pricing public. A species that could see monopolies could break them. And a species that chose to announce the seeing before the breaking was either very principled or very strategic, and both possibilities warranted Category 3 attention. Behind them, Delegate Prefect Krosh stood in the corridor and watched them go. Tethik was already pulling up consultation scheduling on his tablet. Rule, the Korath observer who had never been officially present, was composing a message to his own delegation that began with a sentence he had never expected to write about humans. Rule's message began, reclassify human commercial capability assessment from negligible to primary strategic concern. Recommend immediate allocation of dedicated analytical resources. Full report to follow. He reviewed the sentence, found it accurate, and sent it. Then he composed a second message, this one private, to the Korath Dominion's chief commercial strategist, a functionary named Tessek who had spent 40 years building the Dominion's trade intelligence architecture, and who had, in all that time, never received a priority-flagged message about humans. Rule's message to Tessek was longer and more specific. It described the dependency-weighted annotation in Round 5, the relational model in Round 6, and the adaptation cost framework in Round 7. It described these frameworks not as isolated innovations, but as evidence of a systemic analytical capability, the ability to operate simultaneously inside and outside every other species' economic logic. It noted that this capability had been demonstrated by 4 individuals working from publicly available data. It did not speculate about what might be possible if the humans scaled up. The implication was sufficient. Tessek would read the message in 14 hours, when the Korath Dominion's communication relay completed its scheduled cycle. He would read it twice. He would then do something he had not done in 11 years of receiving intelligence assessments. He would forward it unedited to the Dominion's High Commercial Council with a single annotation that read, verify independently and respond. The verification process would take 3 cycles. It would confirm everything Rule had reported. The response would restructure the Concourse Dominion's entire approach to human commercial engagement, a restructuring that would, in time, produce the most productive bilateral trading relationship the Dominion had established in 2 centuries. But that was later. That was the future building itself on the foundation of a single morning. The corridor was quiet. The exhibition was over. The score was 7 for 7, and the concourse of settled commerce had a new trading partner that had walked in with 4 people and a case of paper, and had walked out with a record that 46 species in 900 years had not managed. In the pricing tribunal's gallery, adjudicator Vesk was updating the exhibition's historical record. The process was ceremonial as much as administrative. The record was physical, maintained in a bound volume that had been in continuous use for 412 years, its pages thick with the careful annotations of Vesk's predecessors. Each entry followed a prescribed format: species name, qualifying result, delegation size, date of assessment. The format had not changed in the record's history because it had never needed to change. The results it documented had always fit within its categories. Under the column for first attempt qualifying results, she added a new entry. It was the first addition to that column in 400 years. The ink was the same formulation the tribunal had used since the record's inception, a mineral-based compound that bonded permanently with the page fiber and could not be altered or erased. The permanence was the point. What went into the record stayed. The entry was brief. It read Earth, 7 of 7 for analysts. Vesk looked at it for a moment. The entry occupied a single line in a volume of hundreds of pages, a few words among thousands. But the space it occupied in the concourse's institutional understanding was considerably larger. 400 years of empty space in that column, 4 centuries during which no species had been good enough on its first attempt to earn the highest result. And then, in a single morning, 4 humans with printed paper and a methodology that no one in 900 years of trade sophistication had thought to attempt. She looked at the entry a moment longer. Then she added a note in the margin in her own hand, outside the formal record. It was not the kind of annotation an adjudicator typically made. It was the kind of note a professional wrote when they had witnessed something they expected to be thinking about for the rest of their career. It said, "They counted everything we didn't."